All right. Well, I expect people will still be trickling in here, but we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm James Person. I am the director of the Hyundai Motor-Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Great pleasure to welcome you all here for this, I think, very meaningful panel, and I should note, very timely panel, looking at the 30th anniversary of Korean democratization, and of course, its timeliness is due to the most recent developments reaffirming Korea's democracy just 2 weeks ago with the presidential election. We really couldn't have timed this better, I think. We really have a stellar panel for the discussion today. Three very distinguished speakers, all of whom have been studying Korea or have been following Korea and studying Korean affairs for a very, very long time, and were in fact directly involved in the events of 1987. We have Dr. Young-Jik Kim, who is the general director of the National Museum of Korean Contemporary History in Seoul. This is the one that's located right next to the U.S. Embassy. If you haven't visited it, I strongly encourage you to do so. It is an amazing, amazing museum. And I should note, it is a historian's dream because they really do a great job of integrating documentation into their displays. Dr. Kim is one of the leading scholars in Korea on modern Korean political history. Before being named the director of the museum in 2015, he taught at many schools for almost a decade at Sungshin Women's University. He also taught at Seoul National University, at Sogang University, at Hanyang University, Kyunghee University, and at UCLA. He's also worked as a consultant at the Bureau of Overseas Information of the Korean government and was a standing commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of the Republic of Korea. His background is international relations from Seoul National University, and he earned his PhD in political science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We also have with us a great friend, Dr. William Stueck. He's the professor emeritus and a former distinguished professor in the Department of History at the University of Georgia. Dr. Stueck is really one of the top American historians of the Korean War, of U.S.-Korea relations, and of the Cold War, and a longtime partner in crime here at the Wilson Center. Always great to have him back. He's the author of a number of very, very important works on the Korean War, including Rethinking the Korean War, A New Diplomatic and Strategic History, and The Korean War, An International History, which is an absolute must-read. And of course, he's written numerous other articles and book chapters, including one that we hope to be soon publishing here at the Wilson Center. And we are joined also by another good friend who we've had a great opportunity to have here at the Wilson Center in the past, Ambassador Kathleen Stevens. She is the former U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Korea. She is presently the William J. Perry Fellow in the Korea Program at the Walter H. Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford University. She has 4 decades of experience in Korean affairs. First, as a Peace Corps volunteer in rural Korea in the 1970s. She then spent time at the embassy, including in '87, where she was in fact observing a lot of the activities and reporting on a lot of the activities. She was observing among the students and the those protesting and in support of democratization. And then she came back as the ambassador to Korea. She has a very distinguished career in a diplomatic career, having served as acting Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, as I said, Ambassador to the Republic of Korea from 2008 to 2011, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, and many, many other important positions. Again, really excited to have such a distinguished panel, and they will all be speaking for approximately 15 minutes, and we hope to have plenty of time for questions from the audience. Before we begin, I just want to note, there wasn't a note on the announcement, but I encourage you all to join us downstairs on the 4th floor as we conclude. We've been working, the Wilson Center has worked with the National Museum of Korean Contemporary History to curate a fantastic collection of images from Korea's long struggle for democratization from 1948 right up to the present. We're going to be having a reception. Ambassador An will be joining us. So again, I encourage you all to join us immediately after this panel. So without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Dr. Kim for his presentation. Let me just get the slides prepared for you.
Thank you.
If you'd like, you can either way.
Because it's hard to.
Okay. Why don't you, would you like to come over here? Sorry.
Good afternoon. My name is Youngji Kim, and I'm General Director of Korean Contemporary History Museum. I'm very glad to meet you and to talk about Korean democratization history. And this year, it is 30 years anniversary. So we are really very thrilled to have a special photo exhibition here in Washington, D.C. And I thank Director Herman for providing this great opportunity to have this wonderful occasion so that we can develop good relations between U.S. and South Korea. And thank you for let me have this about 15 minutes talk. Okay, thank you. I am involved in research on comparing Korean democratization with England Glorious Revolution, which is very rare kind of work because the two incidents are separated by 300 years. So we call this as a comparative historical research, and I had a hard time in understanding British history, but I finally, got the first paper published this year, and the second one will come in next year, and this is another draft of another paper. So the three papers will be compiled as a single volume book and will be published probably next year. So my presentation is based on my research on the central event. We call this June Great Struggle or June Great Uprising of 1987. So people call it a various way, but anyway, we call this the fateful and eventful year of 1987 as the very beginning of contemporary democracy. Let me clarify the meaning of democratization first. Actually, it is the re-democratization, not the first democratization, because the Korean Republic when it was established in 1948, they they sort of established really democratic republic based on modern constitution. It is a presidential system, but it is also mixed with cabinet, European style cabinet system. So Korean democracy started right at the beginning. But as you know, we were at that time liberated by the U.S. After World War II, and Korea was at that time the poorest country in the world. So we had really hard time in understanding what democracy meant. Anyway, we first started with really excellent Western style democratic constitution, but the presidents soon became very authoritarian style. So they, the first founder of our modern nation, the famous President Seungman Lee, really did a lot of things in establishing the nation, but in later years he became a dictator. Maybe in the last 2 or 3 years, he was clearly ruling the country in dictatorial mode. But after 1960, there was a brief democratic regime for about a year. It was a European-style cabinet system run by Prime Minister Chang. It was 100% democratic state, but he was very, weak in his leadership style, so he could not rule the country effectively. And the military revolution of 61, General Park led new military coup, and the era of Park Chung-hee began, and it lasted 2 decades, almost 2 decades, 18 years. And the story of democratization begins when Park Chung-hee was assassinated by his close aides in October 1979. So what we see is first attempt of democratization failed with tragic incident of Gwangju in the May of 1980. Scholars who studied political history, they unanimously agree that this is the first major incident, but that ended in tragic way. So after almost 7 or 8 years, we see real democratization. That is 1987. So it took almost 7 or 8 years for for us to see full democracy after the death of President Park. And now even this event has passed so many years, and 30 years have passed. So what is the current state of Korean politics? We call that either democracy or democracy after democratization. Anyway, it is democracy, but there are so many kinds of different democracies that people and even scholars disagree as to the nature of and definition of democracy. Anyway, Korea has clearly one of the very dynamic and vibrant democracy. As we see, our president was impeached, a few months ago, and we have new President Moon, who has very, contrasting style, very democratic style. But anyway, it is a typical system of democracy. After his single term, we need to find new president because Korean constitution doesn't allow second term. Anyway, that is a very, very unique kind of Korean style. So I'll just give just a short talk so that you can understand the background of our exhibition today. First, Korea belongs to the third wave democratization. And third wave democratization is proposed by Sam Huntington in 1991, and he was very accurate when he understood Korea belonged to that group in third wave, and there were very related events at that time. I think Philippine case is directly related to Korean case because they just gave a great impact when they introduced democratization in their country a year ago, 1986. So Korean people learned probably a lot from just watching, Philippine case. And the second point that I want to bring is Korean case is a case of success. It is not case of failure. When the authoritarianism fails, of course, they recede and democratic leaders come into the space. But Korean case is different. The authoritarianism never failed. They achieved economic success. So it is crisis out of success, a very paradoxical, case. So because they achieved economic success, they have to go back to their barrack. So it is a very different kind of process, and the President Chun was sort of considered as very powerful and very authoritarian, but also very successful leader. And here we see two democratic fighters who later became presidents of Korea. On the left, there's Kim Dae-jung. On the right, there's Kim Young-sam. Kim Young-sam represented democratic force around Busan area, Busan and Masan, and Kim Dae-jung represented a political force of Gwangju area. They were political rivals, but they were also close friends, and they became later presidents. Okay, let's move. And you see the Hyundai automobiles ready for export, to the United States. That was, taken at 1987 or 86. At that time, Korean automobiles came to the United States, and it became very popular, and that represented the success of Korean economic development. And Hyundai and Kia are very strong even today in global market in automobile industry. And there's a few great moment when there's new development in political arena, and the major victory was achieved by oppositional party in February of 1985. February 1985, they surprisingly came back. Even they were oppressed for a number of years by military leaders. They made dramatic comeback for this election. So right after February, government leaders and opposition leaders, there were, new equilibrium of power. So government leaders cannot underestimate or neglect these oppositioner voices. So new era sort of began, but still under authoritarian regime. And other important aspect is opposition party made alliance with social movement sector. Social movement is very much in vogue in 1980s and 1990s, and still it is very popular and strong in South Korea. It's all related to the previous era of Park Chung-hee military rule, because Park Chung-hee sent so many young people to the prison, so after they came out, they became included in this new arena of social movement. So social movement sector became larger and powerful by virtue of this oppression of, thanks to the oppression of former President Park. Anyway, so this is already very changed mood that we find in this period, 1985-1986. So President Chun decided to introduce new policy, and he suggested parliamentary cabinet rules. After travel to the Europe, he came back and he announced that we need European style of cabinet rules. But those democratic leaders didn't trust President Chun, and they wanted to stick with presidential ruling system. So they were competing, and they had to decide whether to cooperate or to maintain, more tenacious and fighting spirit against their opponent. And here we see the famous Cardinal Kim Soo-hwan, who was sort of, who can be compared to Saint, no, not Saint, Bishop, John Paul II, who supported Polish democratization. So he is quite a figure like him. He really wanted to see Korea democratization, and he was the chief of Myeongdong Cathedral, where students and protesters, gathered and staged strikes and demonstrations. So Myeongdong Cathedral belonged to a religious realm, and it is sort of, part of civil society. So many political scientists and social scientists analyzed that civil society was ready to provide success of Korean democratization. Anyway, so this great person, Cardinal Kim, he symbolized the religious and civil society spirit, and he was very influential, very popular in Korea. Almost everybody supported him, trusted him. Even Buddhists or non-Christians also trusted this person, Cardinal Kim. And there's great role by the United States, and Professor Stueck wrote excellent paper that U.S. played during this period, and so I'll just move to the last occasion. Here we see Mr. Roh-tae-woo, a great friend of former President Chun, and he was most powerful and second most powerful person in the Fifth Republic of Korea. So many people believe that he would be next president, but of course he had many other people competing with him, so he didn't quite know whether he would be president or not. But anyway, he was considered a very moderate and not hardliner, but very soft and gentle. So he was very popular even outside Korea, and many, outside experts in Korea really liked Roh-tae-woo. Anyway, he pronounced constitutional amendment that he would, strongly support. So he made a special declaration on June 29, and that was a great historical decision. Of course, that decision was not done just by himself, but former president, the President Chun strongly supported his decision and even suggested. But as we all know, Mr. Chun is a very authoritarian style man, and he is he's different, totally different. Anyway, he even understood that in 1987 there's no other way but to compromise, because there's so powerful, popular, demonstrations being, held throughout the whole country, and especially the month of June, not a single day passed without demonstration throughout almost the whole nation, and not just in Seoul, but in many other major regional cities. There were tens of thousands people gathered and shouted, the end of military rule, and requested that they need new constitution or new president, and they want to select their president by themselves, which means the constitution should be changed. So this great democratic transition from Korean politics is sort of very sudden and unexpected if you are just not an expert of Korean politics. If you're just a general citizen, it is really a very unexpected thing. So we need to take a look at why and how it became possible. Well, because my time is up, I'll just move on. Here you see two presidents. President Kim Young-sam, who's not a president at that time, but Mr. Roh-tae-woo is president, and he supported this former fighter and Democrat Kim Young-sam, and they made party. They had two different parties, but there were talk and agreements, and they try to, you know, cooperate with new kind of constitution, but they could not change the constitution later. But they sort of continued their cooperative relations. So the Kim Il-sung became government candidate for presidency, and he became next president with the help of you know, President Roh Tae-woo. So they sort of, you know, who were, you know, enemy, not really, but they were just, you know, competing, and they were against each other for a number of years, but they finally, you know, became very close, and new era began. So people misunderstand that Kim Il-sung is democratic president and Roh Tae-woo is non-democratic president. That's wrong. They are both very democratic because democracy was restored at the last moment of the Fifth Republic of Mr. President Chun's era. So both two belong to a democratic period, and they pursued democratic reforms. And Kim Il-sung especially was a very powerful president who really neutralized the military. That was one of the great achievements of Kim Il-sung. And later, there's Kim Dae-jung, who finally became president in 1997. So those who cooperated and compromised, they all shared power. They all became presidents. Roh Tae-woo, Kim Il-sung, and Kim Dae-jung. So the first 15 years of democratization era was really consistent in the sense that they had same constitution. Not only the first phase, the second phase also, you know, was run by same constitution. The Constitution of 1987 still in the same you know, constitution. But now many Korean people want to change the whole constitution, and probably we need better constitution or different kind of style like European, you know, cabinet system. There are so many, you know, new suggestions and new ideas, but still we have 1987 constitution. And in the second phase, we have three different, you know, presidents. President Roh Moo-hyun and President Lee Myung-bak, as you see, and President Park Geun-hye, most recent president, unfortunately, who were you know, impeached. So these three presidents belong to, in my opinion, second phase of democratization. They're all very democratic, but they are, you know, full of, you know, problems because you know, democracy doesn't solve many things. They provide also weakness, and the government become very divided because we are in the era of plural democratic system, multi-democratic system. So many parties belong to oppositional parties. So government party is really not dominating the legislative branch. So the government is divided because president power is constantly checked by the power of National Assembly. Not only checked, it's really strongly challenged by National Assembly in Korean case. So the democratization has many problems, and each president has his or her unique problem. And so anyway, okay, let me go to the conclusion. If you compare Korean case with British case of glorious revolution, there are so many commonalities. I'll just mention a few. First, they achieved revolutionary success in second attempt. In their first attempt, they failed. Both English people and Korean people failed. In English case, in 1640s, there were first revolution, but it was considered as failure because the king, the monarchy returned and restored their era in 1660s, and so they need to continue their revolutionary activities. So they had second attempt and finally succeeded. That's glorious revolution of 1688. And that great event changed the whole aspect of British politics, society, and British economy. And British became most powerful nation in the whole world after 20 or 30 years of this great revolution. And Korean case might be considered as similar to that if we can continue, if we can improve in many fields, political and economic and in other fields. But we have great challenges too. But anyway, Korea succeeded also in their second attempt. I said in Gwangju, May 1979, we had tragic failure. But in the second attempt, after 8 years, in 1987, we succeeded. So it is second attempt. And they are both a democratization by compromise. The compromise is major aspect of this change. In British case, Whigs and Tories, they have had to compromise because the new king is even not British. He is Dutch. In Korean case, we also didn't want to see civil war. So there was so the last final page of my presentation. You see this figures. So many great leaders of contemporary era. They are very powerful, and you see Mr. Trump and also Mr. Xi Jinping, and our new President Moon. So democratization doesn't solve everything, and people they want not only democracy, they also want success of their nation. So democratic leader and democracy has to solve, kind of two different type of question. One is politics, and one is related to legitimacy, and the other is economic problem, bringing the wealth to the nation. And it is not easy. Thank you very much.
No, pleasures.
I'm going to try and be very concise and leave it to you to ask any questions of me if you want later on. My task is to talk about the American role in democratization in Korea, and I'm going to cover the period from 48 to 87, a period during which, for the most part, Americans could be proud of their own democracy. And I'm going to talk about three key, albeit interacting variables here that influence the success and failure of American efforts to promote democracy in Korea. First is the ideological dimension of the Cold War struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States, which had both a political and an economic dimension. Second, the U.S. concern about security, that is ROK, Republic of Korea security, and finally, Korean nationalism, which was not always pushing us in the direction we necessarily wanted Korea to go. I want to just pick out three events from the pre-Korean War period, one that Dr. Kim mentioned, and then move forward pretty rapidly. The first event is the Constitution, which was created during the spring and summer of 1948. The United States, of course, had taken the lead through the United Nations to create the Republic of Korea. But in fact, in writing the Constitution, the Koreans basically ignored the United States, and they came up with a constitution that was based more often than not on the Weimar Republic Constitution of Germany in the interwar period rather than the American. Constitutions, of course, are only as good as the people who are in charge of executing them, and I think by any estimation Dr. Syngman Rhee was less than perfect, although he obviously faced very difficult circumstances. And I think what was created in 1948, especially if we look at the period before the Korean War, would be what Fareed Zakaria has called illiberal democracy. That is, you had elections, but you basically also had a police state, in which the state did not basically honor human rights and necessarily constitutional processes. That's the nationalist dimension, the lack of American influence basically on the direct influence, at least on the Constitution. The security dimension is clear in a memo that John Muccio, the first American ambassador to the Republic of Korea, sent to the State Department in September of 1949. And he says, the government of the ROK is hardly more than 30 miles from where its soldiers and police are frequently engaged in armed conflict with an aggressive enemy. In various places in South Korea, numerous bands of communist guerrillas raid, murder, and plunder the nearby countryside. Within the past 3 months, there have been at least 4 fairly large battles fought along the 38th parallel. Pyongyang radio fills the air with demands for the liquidation of every member of the government and with appeals to the army and police to turn their weapons on their leaders. Consequently, it has been difficult for me privately to advise the Korean president against certain extreme actions which his government has taken. And I think there you have both the security issue and the nationalistic issue. That is the concern that the South Koreans were, especially Rhee, were not always going to accept American advice even when it was given. Nonetheless, on the eve of the Korean War, Secretary of State Dean Acheson sent an aide memoir to the ROK government. This would be early April of 1950, in which he admonished the South Koreans to hold a scheduled legislative election at the end of May rather than postponing it, as Rhee had announced he would, and also to bring about currency reform and reform in the military. And in fact, in this particular case, that advice worked. In fact, Acheson threatened that the Foundation for Military and Economic Aid, American, to the Republic of Korea would be compromised unless he took American advice in this case. A relatively free election was held at the end of May 1950. A National Assembly was elected that was nothing if not ambivalent, even perhaps a little bit hostile towards Rhee. Reform of the currency and to control inflation was done, and certain changes in personnel at the top of the Army was also made. All of this before North Korea attacked. And then the war came. And of course, that was a huge impediment to the growth of democracy. It greatly strengthened the Rhee regime in 1952 against the Constitution. He demanded that the National Assembly amend the Constitution so he could run for a second term. When it refused, he declared martial law, arrested a bunch of the members of the National Assembly, and essentially imposed his will on the Republic of Korea. Now, he did that with largely the support of the South Korean people. So it wasn't as if he was acting against the national will, and the Americans went along with it, but he certainly was acting against constitutional government. So again, you may have democracy in the sense that the popular will was accepted, but certainly not constitutional government. Now, the one case in the early years, which I think Dr. Kim mentioned in passing, where the United States did actually help to push towards a liberal democracy, was in the spring of 1960. And in this case, we have an instance which is comparable in many ways to 1987, in which the security factor is in sync with democratization. In fact, it's in sync also with economic development. So you have those factors all going together, even with nationalism, because there is a popular uprising against Rhee and his forces rigging an election in March, and there's widespread discontent. And the Americans actually fear if Rhee doesn't leave, there's going to be serious civil disorder on an ongoing basis, and that is going to threaten the security of the Republic of Korea. So the United States does assist in easing Rhee out of power and supporting the new government. Then, however, the new government, as Dr. Kim mentioned, isn't very effective in governing. There doesn't seem to be a strong move towards economic development. There is a fair amount of unrest. There's considerable corruption within the government. So that when Park Chung-hee initiates his coup in May of 1961, the Americans essentially do nothing, their primary concern being with the fact that Park had in his past an association with the Korean Workers' Party, the Communist movement, in 1946 through 1948. But once it became clear that Park was not going to be a communist, if anything, anything but, and that there was no popular uprising or even unrest during his coup and widespread support for the constitutional government, and given the fact that soon after he took over, it was clear that he was a strong believer in a focus on economic development, the United States went along. I will say that in 1962 and 63, the United States did exert considerable pressure on Park to hold a democratic election, to become a civilian leader. He won a free election in 1963. Again, though, we're talking about illiberal democracy, not liberal democracy, because even though a new constitution was drawn up and he became a civilian leader, the KCIA, the Korean CIA, was consistently a compromiser of human rights and really above board of government. And during the years from 1963 to 1980, or 79, when he was assassinated, Park gradually moved towards greater and greater authoritarianism. Now, at the same time, of course, Korea is hitting the takeoff stage of economic development. And so there is a good deal of support for Park in South Korea and a good deal of support for him in the United States. And of course, the Nixon-Kissinger foreign policy approach was not to emphasize human rights. Interestingly enough, though, from the bottom up, there was developing a strong favorable attitude towards political reform. And here I don't think Greg Brzezinski's here today, is he? He's written really a magnificent book on nation building in South Korea. And the biggest strength of the book is his tracing the efforts of USIS and private organizations like the Ford Foundation to promote education, to promote modernization in thought as well as the economy, to the point where by the time you get into the mid-1970s, you have a much more educated population and an emerging middle class that you hadn't had previously. And so there's more and more pressure from below to reform and move towards democracy. Nonetheless, in 1980, of course, as Dr. Kim has outlined, there was in the aftermath of Park's assassination and considerable hope within both the United States and South Korea that this would lead to the promotion of democracy. Of course, Chun Doo-hwan initiates a coup d'etat and takes over in an authoritarian manner, if anything even more severe than that of the late Park Chung-hee. The United States doesn't do anything really to prevent it. And I want to just read one quote from Ambassador Glastein, William Glastein, who was the head of the American mission in Korea in 1979 and 1980. This is a cable that he sent to Washington on January 29th, 1980, at a point when Chun Doo-hwan had taken over the army in a coup the previous December and was clearly moving towards an authoritarian regime. Glastein writes, "Our key positions are to urge the government to move ahead with political liberalization, the military to remain unified and refrain from crude intervention in politics, and the opposition to be patient. But our activist role is not an easy one, and eventually we will be damned if we do and damned if we don't by various elements of society seeking our support. If we don't do enough, dangerous events could occur. If we try to do too much, we may provoke strong chauvinist reactions. Few realize that our influence is limited, in large part by the fact that we could not pull our powerful security and economic levers without risk of destroying the ROK's stability." Again, you see there really a combination of the nationalistic factor, the concern that if we're too overt in putting pressure on Chun Doo-hwan, there's going to be a reaction by a significant portion of the population, basically more of the older people and the pro-military people. On the other hand, there is this surge from below, which is going to hold it against us if we don't take overt action. But at the same time, he's concerned about the security of the Republic of Korea. And we have to remember, at this time, the Soviet Union has just attacked Afghanistan. The new Iranian regime has held hostages in the embassy, the American embassy in Tehran. And Carter is struggling for his political life against not only Reagan's insurgency, but an insurgency within his own party by Ted Kennedy. So the United States is not in a strong position to take a strong stand. And the Koreans, or a large portion of the Korean population at this time, is saying, well, where are you? You've trained us in democratic principles, you've taught us these things, you've promoted them in our society, and now where are you when we need you? So the fact that we didn't take strong action at that time certainly led to greater and greater anti-Americanism during the 1980s. And the one thing I can say when we look at 1987 and the different outcome in terms of the American influence, and I don't mean to suggest that the American influence was primary, because I don't think it was, is that the Americans learned from their mistakes or their failures in 1980. In 1986, a key event was the takeover of the American embassy by Jim Lilly, the new ambassador who replaced Dixie Walker. Walker had played an important role in the early 80s in reestablishing a strong relationship between the ROK regime and the United States, which had suffered severely under Carter. He was not the person in 1986, as we moved towards a crisis in 1987, to face down Chun Doo-hwan. Jim Lilly was. Lilly was a former CIA operative rather than a career Foreign Service officer like Bill Glastein. He was tall, he was self-confident, he was robust, you could say perhaps a little bit arrogant. And Korean politics at that time, still are, but less so now than they were in those days, extremely masculine. And Chun Doo-hwan was the epitome of Korean masculinity. Lily could stand up to him. And one thing he did when he got there in mid-1986 was he instituted a new publication called Current Events and News, which was in Korean. And it was distributed by the embassy or by personnel of the embassy to college campuses, to business groups, to churches, to newspapers. And the objective of it was to make sure that the American word got out in anticipating a constitutional crisis in 1987, because that was where Chun Doo-hwan was going to have to make a decision as to whether to give up power the next year or whether to try and strong-arm his way into another term in office. In 1979-80, Chun Doo-hwan had fairly effectively prevented us from getting our word out to the Korean population. In fact, had even manipulated the press in a way that made most Koreans believe that the United States actually supported the military action he took against his own population in May of 1980. That didn't happen in 1987, and part of the reason was that Lily instituted this journal and distributed it through his own personnel. With all this, a crisis emerged in June, as Dr. Kim has recounted, and the best evidence, the best of the limited evidence we have here, based on basically oral histories, and I must say the late Don Oberdorfer, former journalist for the Washington Post, in his book, The Two Koreas, really took the lead here. But in one of his interviews, he was told that actually in the morning of June 19th, 1987, Chun Doo-hwan had actually set out a preliminary order to prepare for martial law to be begun the next day. Lily met with Chun apparently early in the afternoon of June 19th, and he did so to deliver a letter that Reagan had written on June 17th, and Chun had postponed a meeting with him for 2 days. Now the letter, in fact, James just gave us copies of the letter before this session, was a very friendly letter, but nonetheless, it said, for example, this is to Chun Doo-hwan now, I applaud your commitment to a peaceful transfer of presidential power next year as a crucial step in strengthening that institution of democratic government. But at the same time, before that, he said that our military commitment to you is absolute, it's secure, okay? So there was a certain amount of ambiguity in it, even though there was some obvious pressure. Well, Lily went beyond the letter in talking to Chun on that day and made it clear that if he used the military to repress the popular uprising that was developing, that there might be a real serious problem with the U.S.-South Korean alliance. And the evidence that we have now is, in fact, that it was shortly after that meeting that Chun actually reversed the order. So I think it's clear on the one hand that it was the massive uprising that was far beyond actually in scope than it had been in 1980 that created a real security situation that concerned the United States. That is, again, security trumps democracy. They're in sync in 1987. If there is not democracy, the Americans calculate there's going to be civil war, because the middle class has joined extensively in the demonstrations in 1987, whereas it had not in 1980. So I think although the Koreans deserve by far the most credit for their democratization in 1987, I think the United States did play a very significant role as well. Thank you.
Ambassador Stevens, did you want to?
I think I can just stay here. I'm going to perform more of the role, I think, of kind of commentator, because we've had two very full presentations that I have certainly much been enjoyed hearing and been stimulated by. And if I can just also add my thanks to the Wilson Center. It's always great to be here. I always learn so much. I always learn more than I receive more than I give, and today is no exception. I've been a visitor on several occasions to the Museum of Contemporary History in Seoul, and I also join James in commending all of you if you get to Korea. Be sure and go there. It's right next door to the American Embassy. You can see what some good redesign does to an otherwise unpromising building. It's kind of before and after shot, you know. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Ways in which Korea has changed, ways in which it hasn't. I am so pleased that this kind of event is taking stock, and for all the reasons James said, you know, it's 30 years and all that's happened this year, maybe not just in Korea, but in our own country, is a time to really think about what, in my view, is in modern Korea's history, just as great an accomplishment as the much more talked about economic transformation. This not inevitable, in my view, a political transformation that occurred in a fairly short period of time. Having said it's fairly short, I think we're right to kind of go back to the 40s, and I'm going to try to kind of take it up to the present time in some ways in terms of thinking about, adding to Professor Kim's remarks and kind of where the 80s left us, if you like. But I'm going to talk, I have to say, in pretty personal terms. I know I'm kind of better known for having been the U.S. ambassador in Korea from 2008 to 2011. I was in the Peace Corps in the 70s during the Yushin period when Park Chung-hee was president, and I was in rural Korea. But in many ways, certainly the longest period I spent in Korea and the most memorable years of my career was from 1983 to 1989. When I was a political officer at the American Embassy in Seoul, and then subsequently in Busan as the principal officer of our previously firebombed, speaking of establishment there. So I was there for a lot of this, and they were just seeing the photographs out there. I saw them before coming in here, and listening to these presentations has just flooded with memories. I'm going to try not to flood you with all of that. But I just wrote down a few things I thought I'd kind of mention. I mean, first of all, Professor Stueck, I really do appreciate your mentioning Ambassador James Lilly. I worked for two ambassadors in Korea during my time there, and one was Dixie Walker, Ambassador Walker, and then Jim Lilly. And when I went to my confirmation hearing to be ambassador many years later in 2008, Ambassador Lilly accompanied me and came to my swearing in, and I always considered him a great mentor and someone from whom I learned so many lessons. And I second your thought that a person can make a difference, and it was a very inspiring kind of lesson to me that there are many, many factors going to what happened in that period, and I also agree with you that the American role, while important, was not the decisive element. But when Ambassador Lilly arrived, in addition to the things you mentioned, he met, this seems like a small thing. In fact, people are amazed sometimes when I mention it. He met with Kim Yong-sam and the opposition, and that was known. You know, even back then, even without the internet, there were informal means of communication in Korea, and people knew about it, and it really resonated. But there were other things happening at that time, too, and I'm going to mention a few of them. I have a long list here. I'm trying to be particular about what I mention. Again, when I arrived in 1983, Chun Doo-hwan had been in power for about 3 years. There was tremendous anger at the United States, which I heard all the time because, one, I spoke enough Korean to understand what people were saying, including people who didn't speak English, and two, my job was to cover internal politics. And I spent hours every day hearing people give me a version of what had happened in Gwangju, give me a version of what they thought had been the shortcomings of the American role in 1979 to 1980. In my view, some of it, was inaccurate or exaggerated. But it was very frustrating that there was very little evidence or information out there to really address it. I appreciate what you said about efforts to do that over the years. We certainly tried, but it actually was not until 1989 that we wrote and the State Department published a kind of the U.S. Analysis of the U.S. role in Gwangju in 1980. Again, it's something people can take issue with, but it's in terms of lessons learned, it's something I wish we had done sooner, whether it was published immediately in Korea or not. What I also saw, though, in arriving in Korea in the early 80s is that the Chun government had begun a process, some of it under some pressure from the United States as well as from its own people, of gradual liberalization. That was the word that was used for it. Chun Doo-won had a plan, and the plan was he was going to contribute to the Republic of Korea's democratization by stepping down after a single 7-year term. And that, he thought, would be sufficient to satisfy people, that this was a step forward. But then he wanted, of course, to play a role in assuring who a successor was, and therefore there was this indirect electoral college means of choosing his successor, and people knew for years, if you like, that this successor was going to be his great friend from the Korean Military Academy and fellow former general, Mr. No Tae-woo. And then you had on top of that, I'm just mentioning some things that perhaps add to Professor Kim's great presentation, the Olympics. The Seoul Olympics was coming in 1988. So this was a scenario which, in its own way, sort of was a part of this idea of gradual liberalization. Let's be gradual. So gradually we'll lift the controls on some of the politicians and students. You see, many students had been sent off to jail. Many politicians were under a political ban. The first Word document I ever did on a computer, this is so long ago, was a list of politicians under political ban and so-called political prisoners in Korea. It was thousands of people. And then part of my job, I decided it was my job, was to keep track as people were taken off the ban. And they were, gradually. Kim Dae-jung was in exile in the United States after his death sentence had been commuted under pressure from the United States. He came back. And so gradually you had this atmosphere where things were loosening up a bit. And then you had the demonstrations on the campuses and pressures on the campuses. But as Professor Kim mentioned, and this is something I remember very, very well, the February 1985 election, which despite the still very authoritarian regime, was in this period of liberalization, and people took advantage of it. And they pushed it a little bit further. A couple of other things, I'm already talking longer than I thought I would, that I think were important, both in terms of, if I can say, the U.S. playing a certain role, and secondly, in terms of just what was happening. And one was the issue of torture. There were several instances, more than several, when students, university students, the conscience of the nation, these young men and women who had, at great sacrifice, generally by their parents, were going to the universities of Korea, still much less common than it is now to actually be able to go to a university. And they were out there demonstrating these pretty ritualized but oftentimes pretty violent confrontations with heavily armed riot police, not armed with guns, but armed with pepper gas and using physical force. That these students, when they were taken in, were, not to put too fine a point on it, tortured, including something that's a lot like kind of a relative of waterboarding. We learned about waterboarding ourselves not so long. A student died from this. A couple of students died from it. And this was not, despite a controlled press, something that the regime could keep secret. And it was not something that the U.S. could keep silent about. So I would also add to your list of things that the U.S. did, which I saw make an impact on the attitudes of the highly critical people that I was seeing each and every day in the student and the labor community, was George Shultz, our Secretary of State, came to Korea, this was about 1985, I believe, to see the newly built Seoul Olympic Stadium and to show support for a secure and safe South Korea hosting the Olympics. It was a wonderful occasion. And then after that, he had a short press conference, and he simply said, you can look up torture is never acceptable. You don't torture. This is a public message. This is a private message. It had an impact. And there were subsequent sacrifices that followed. But the U.S. position was always clear. And it always, I have to say, disturbed me in later years when our own position on torture became somewhat muddied. I think we were not able to speak maybe in recent incidents, not in Korea, but elsewhere, in the way we were back in the 80s. Another very important moment, I'm getting up to 1987, was when our Assistant Secretary for East Asian Affairs, Gaston Seeger, gave a speech, not in Korea, but in New York. And he talked about very diplomatic language, very measured, but he talked about U.S. hopes for political progress and reform in Korea. And he called for the civilianizing of Korean politics. Now, well, most people wouldn't think that's much of a word. That word went like a lightning bolt through Korean society, civilianizing. Now, it was pretty clear what he meant. And had a real impact on, again, not just elite attitudes or the attitudes in the Blue House, but on the street, that the U.S. wanted to see, was serious about wanting to see real change. But I certainly agree with my colleagues here that the real force for this was the Korean people themselves. The 80s was a period of, at times, double-digit economic growth, 10% and more. The Olympics were coming. I think that was extremely important to all sides, not just those people on the streets. And in this period of trying to manage, I think one of the lessons is maybe you can't really manage the liberalization. You can't manage democratization. It takes on a life and a force of its own. So in June 1987, I mean, my memory is that, we weren't sure what was going to, we in the American embassy, but all the Koreans I knew weren't sure what was going to happen. It seemed like that Chun and No Tae-woo kind of figured out they had a party conference where they nominated No Tae-woo. This was like the least surprising political party conference like ever held. And actually Jim Lilly, Ambassador Lilly, against the advice of firebrands like me in the political section and my boss, went to the party conference. Most ambassadors didn't go. He said, I want to go because it's one step. And we said, oh, it's just a show. You shouldn't be there. He went because he also understood he needed to make sure that he kept his lines open across the way. Another lesson I really learned from that. But at any event, they had the convention. No Tae was nominated. It wasn't any big surprise. And for a few days, it seemed like nothing really happened. The students continued to protest. There was pepper gas on the campus. But then somehow, and people started coming out on the streets in Gwanghwamun, on Uchilo, and it was the people that was the so-called necktie brigades, right, of people working in offices. It was people from the markets, and every afternoon, this wasn't like the whole city shut down, but about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, suddenly people were out and they were marching, and they had one slogan, one banner. I think this is another thing that was very effective. We want to elect the president with our own hands. Of course, there was a long agenda of things, release of prisoners, freedom of the press, so on and so forth, investigation of Gwangju, a number of things. But the bumper sticker was, we want a direct election of the president. If the Philippines can have it, why can't we? We're ready. And that brought people out. And then you had this building. Lots and lots of foreign journalists arriving. So my memory, this is my last thing from the 80s, and I'll go on, of June 29th, I remember it very clearly. The morning of June 29th, I went into the embassy. Basically, our practice then, those of us in the political section, then there's like 3 or 4 of us doing this, was we were kind of out all night or all afternoon into the evenings, kind of watching the demonstrations and running to payphones and saying, well, there's a lot of tear gas over here, and this is happening, and that, and writing little reports every day. And then every morning, we'd get together with this huge press corps that was now in Seoul, and we would basically compare notes. What's going to happen? So I remember that morning of June 29th, a lot of the reporters, these are foreign reporters, because there were very few people based in Seoul from foreign newspapers at that time, so they were all there trying to figure out what was going on. But rumors, was there going to be martial law, what was going to happen? And I was over in my office, and a colleague of mine was with the reporters, and I got a phone call from somebody I knew in the Korean Security Service who said, "Do you have a TV?" If you do, you should turn it on. So I went and found a TV, a little black and white TV. And the image that came on was the one you're going to see at this exhibition. It was No Teu, visibly shaking, with a piece of paper. And he sat down and he read this statement saying basically, here are 8 points of democratization, starting with direct election of the president. Essentially, I accept all of the opposition demands. And I'm now going to go to President Chan, maybe this is all stage managed, and ask for him to agree to this. Yeah. So I went over to where the journalists were being briefed by my colleague, and I walked in. This is really a great highlight in my life, and I sort of said, and again, we were saying, well, we don't know. It's going to be martial law or the troop movements or what are the students planning? And I said, I have something you may want to hear. And I said, I just heard No Teu say this on TV. This is not an official, translation. This is just what I heard. You may want to check it out. Everyone got up and ran out of the room to go find out and to file their reports. And subsequently, of course, we were really eager to find out what was going on too. I don't think that Jim Lilly or anybody had advance notice. I mean, clearly, as you outlined, we were in close contact. But this was something that took us all by surprise in the clarity of it. But then there was still a lot to follow, and I'm actually going to pass to James in the Wilson Center a lot of our messages that were just declassified that talk about how we try to kind of figure out. So I'll just read you like one sentence that gives you an idea. This is from June 30th, so the day after, from Embassy Seoul to the Secretary of State, Washington D.C. NIAC immediate. NIAC means you should wake up at night to read this. Okay, so, yeah. This message provides our initial thoughts on yesterday's dramatic developments and their implications for our policy. No Teu's June 29th announcement calling for direct presidential elections and Kim Dae-jung's amnesty, this was a part of it too, has transformed the atmosphere in Seoul and prompted near euphoria in the opposition and general public. No's initiative offers the prospect of substantial democratic progress, but it also entails greater risks. And then we have to go into that. But when you see those pictures, you'll see that euphoria there. But what you'll also see are photographs of what happened in the next few months. Again, big demonstrations. There was another young man who tragically died with a tear gas canister, killed him just before all this happened. But then you had the start of a political campaign. And suddenly, so the election was in October, right? I believe. December. Sorry, it was in December. It all gets, yeah. The Constitution was revised in October. It's still the Constitution that operates today. And then the election in December. The two Kims, the Kim Young-sam and Kim Dae-jung, who said they'd always stick together, split apart. So you had this kind of three major candidate race. But suddenly, I mean, for those of us who'd been I'd been, 3 or 4 years at this, going out to these demonstrations, which were always broken up with pepper gas and violence and so on. I wanted to talk about Cardinal Kim too, actually, but who did play a very important role. I agree with that. But within these few months, these political rallies were being held, and again, you'll see photographs of them. 1 million people. I was in Busan. There were 1 million people in that field seeing Kim Young-sam. In Yeouido, a similar kind of crowd for Kim Dae-jung and subsequently for No Teu. This is in a country where just a few months before, if a crowd of 30 people gathered, certainly if they gathered in support of Kim Dae-jung or Kim Young-sam, they would have been tear gassed and arrested. So it was an extraordinary thing to see this happen in such a compressed amount of time. Now, so I'm already been too long. I left Korea in 1989. No Teu was president. I came back to working on Korea in 2005 at the State Department. No Moo-hyun was president. But everything else is different. It was a bit of a Rip Van Winkle experience. But over that time, both in Washington and subsequently as ambassador, I worked with administrations from different political parties, as indeed other American officials and my predecessors have done. And indeed, and this is, I guess, the main thing I want to say, I know from my own experience that U.S.-South Korean relations are stronger, more resilient, and better than ever because of Korea's democracy. You will find people who will say, oh, the U.S. always likes a conservative government. You'll find some American officials who might say that, or, these people are pro-American, these people not so much, this and that. I mean, I have to say, the U.S.-South Korea relationship has its ups and downs. We oftentimes have very deep disagreements and tensions. But overall democracy, but those have been with both conservative and liberal governments, and the fact that we have a democratic counterpart in South Korea has made all the difference in the blossoming of the relationship. But even more than that, I think here are some of the things that democracy has done in Korea, just to add to Director Kim's thoughts. The issue of legitimacy in South Korean governance has been resolved. When I was in Korea and my friends, I think of the 70s, there was still a lot of anxiety about the sense of, yes, South Korea certainly viewed itself rightly as freer and a better place to be than North Korea, but there was a sense of what is the basis for legitimacy? And being derived from a military sort of coup d'etat, and especially after 1980, where there was such violence, created a problem of legitimacy. This has now been resolved, and it's made a big difference, I think, in Korea's approach to its own country and to the world. Democracy has strengthened security. It hasn't undermined it. Power has transferred us peacefully across the political spectrum, and successive administrations have dealt with crises from economic to security and Korea has come out stronger. And Kim Dae-jung, when he was elected, I think there were expectations. He had an agenda that had a lot to do with inter-Korean reconciliation, social issues in South Korea. The first thing he was confronted with was the so-called IMF crisis. Worked extremely closely with the United States and the international community to address that. Of course, the military is completely out of politics, and I think the role that No Tae-woo and Kim Yong-sam played in that is extremely important. Civilian authority absolutely established. Women's rights are much improved, and I know there's a picture about that out there, although there's still a ways to go on that in many countries. And the respect for human rights, and that I see in things like, this goes back again to my Peace Corps days, there's no more corporal punishment and far less, if you like, hazing, which we saw a lot of, not only in the middle schools and the high schools and the military of Korea, but this is also what underlay a lot of the violence under police custody. A very different atmosphere about all of that. And the thing I like the best, I think, is I really, what I saw when I went back as ambassador to Korea after so many years away, Rip Van Winkle in Korea, was a Korea that had become so much more, I don't use the word dynamic, it was overused, but creative. I don't think, whether you like it or not, that the Korean wave and K-pop and all of that would be possible without democracy. It's just created the kind of soft power that the Republic of Korea has now, to everyone's astonishment throughout the world. I mean, why is Korea a cool place? It wouldn't be cool like that without democracy. And these are for artists who are not even political. What are some of the remaining problems? I think institutional development has been uneven. The introduction of local autonomy has been very important, but not yet fully realized. The National Assembly still is relatively weak, and I think political parties still rather personalized and factionalized. The one-term 5-year presidency does lead, I think, to early lame duck problems. I know this is, and I think this is one reason among several why the new president, Moon Jae-in, is again talking about perhaps trying to see about what would be the first revision of the Constitution since 1987. I regret, if I may say, the tendency that I see in Korean politics towards a kind of retribution and revenge. None of these things are unknown in our own systems, but I think, again, maybe the kind of winner-take-all still within nature of Korean politics is something still to be addressed. And I think that within that context, we saw this is my final point, we saw over the last year a new generation in South Korea go to the streets. Go to the streets following a 2016 National Assembly election where the opposition did extremely well, and voice dissatisfaction. And my own sense is that dissatisfaction, clearly the immediate dissatisfaction was with the sitting president, with her handling of the Sewol tragedy, with the issue of the corruption relationship with people outside the government, with the conglomerates and so on. But what I heard from young people, I was back last November when these big demonstrations were starting to take place, and again, very peaceful, very impressive, followed by a constitutional process, a great tribute to Korea's democracy. But there were other underlying things which I see in some of the sort of discomfort with democracy in our own country and elsewhere. How our democratic systems address perceived downsides of globalization, downsides of all the greater prosperity we enjoy, the hyper-competitiveness of Korea, the sense that upward mobility has become more difficult, all of that. So I think we have a lot to learn from each other, but we also have a lot to be inspired by when we look back 30 years and see all that the Korean people have accomplished.
Great, thank you. Three very rich presentations. We have very little time, but I do want to just take three quick questions from the floor. There will be microphones coming around right up front here. And then you give the next one to that gentleman there, please. She's just trying to get the. Is it on? Ewan, is yours working?
We can probably hear.
All right. There it is. Okay. This one here.
Stephen, sure. Wonderful series of talks. I'm curious about the one problem that no one mentioned, and that is South Korea's neighbor to the north. The current situation and how it might be resolved, or whether the economic situation in the north is beyond the financial ability of South Korea to absorb, unlike it's become like a pathological DDR on the Korean peninsula, whether South Korea could afford to absorb North Korea.
And then right down right here. Go ahead.
Henry Stoller. I'm glad the first questioner asked about the 800-pound elephant in the room. So I'm going to ask a more basic question. What does an embassy such as that we have in Seoul do? How many people work there? What does the political section, where you were ambassador, what does it do? What are the basic functions both in normal times and during this very tense period right now?
And one final question right up here, this gentleman.
Yes, I just want to pick up on a point that Ambassador Stevens said, and that is, do you see parallels between what happened in 1987 in the candlelight vigils against President Park Geun-hye?
Great, thank you.
Who wants to?
Do you want to address the embassy, and then does anyone want to talk about North Korea?
Oh, I can say something about
Okay.
that. I'd be interested in Director Kim's or both of your comments on the parallels between '87 and today. But maybe if you want. Well, in terms of an embassy, I mean, U.S. embassies throughout the world range in size from just a very small handful of people to fairly large, which for us would be several hundred Americans, and we always have an even larger staff of support staff and others, both from the host country, if you like. So the American Embassy in Seoul, I should know. 100 or so Americans, probably several hundred if you can kind of Koreans who also work on the embassy staff. We do always have in Korea a large consular section, which is focused on protecting Americans in the country and assisting them, and visa functions. We have political and economic sections, which are our main policy sections. And yeah, it's a job that's a combination of trying to, be on the ground and understand what's going on and report on that. So a little bit like a journalist, I guess. I always thought maybe I'm flattering myself, but a diplomat was somewhere in between a journalist and a scholar. You're trying to kind of find, have some expertise in the country and provide policy relevant reporting, but it's also to try to explain to people what we're doing. But we cover, we have people at the embassy in Seoul who look at North Korea and coordinate very closely. That's very important with the South Korean government in terms of what we're, both on our defense side and with our military colleagues and our diplomatic efforts vis-a-vis North Korea. Korea's very active global engagement is something we talk with Koreans a lot more about. So I would say fewer people, maybe this last year is an exception, but fewer people than when I was there. Were the three of us who covered domestic politics and human rights. It was a big deal in South Korea. People say to me, wow, now we talk about human rights in North Korea. Back then, human rights in the Carter administration, we didn't talk, it was a very, very difficult issue in the South Korea-U.S. relationship, human rights. We had to follow that and make representations about it, and also as I try to understand what's happening. So that's a very brief, I guess, description. But also, I guess I should say, as Bill mentioned too, our public diplomacy work. And the things mentioned in Greg Brzezinski's book, fostering exchanges. And I think we can be very proud of what we've done, not only in Korea, but throughout the world. And I hope it doesn't end with this year's budget, if I can say, these pay long-term dividends. Our Fulbright programs, our exchange programs, all those things. I mean, I think that underpinned, I agree, underpinned Korea's democratization more than anything else, in some ways, in the high policy action in some ways, in terms of U.S. involvement. I mean, with respect to North Korea, very briefly, I think South Korea, whether under any government, under any party, would prefer to see, as with the United States, gradual change in North Korea rather than sudden change. That's what we'd like to work for. We may not be so lucky. South Korea has looked over the years at what the economic as well as political challenges would be of reunification under a variety of scenarios. And I think actually one reason, not the only reason, that they've kind of grown their overseas development program is because, one, they want to learn lessons from working in development in other countries, but two, they hope they won't be alone, that there will be other countries that will want to play a role in providing clearly the assistance that North Korea does need and would need, and if and when it begins to a process of reform and opening.
Any final thoughts? Or?
Yeah, for the question, parallel between 87 and today, well, it's parallel, but it's different in the sense last and this year's, candlelight and, the huge demonstration. There's, I think, no special movement from the military or, no attempt to rely on, non-political factors in Korean society. Korea is, just safe kind of democracy. Military is totally neutralized. So great change, has been made. You really have to understand that Korea's case is very unique in the sense that the pace of change is so fast. Is just you can incomparable. We call it a compressed, process or compressed development or compressed even democratization. So Korea's 30 years history of democratization can be compared to the 150 years of democratization in England's 17th and 18th century. The time is so compressed, and people change in those years so rapidly. This is totally different, because the people have changed, and probably Koreans have been matured. They have matured kind of a democratic system, and President Moon came to our museum last year, and I met him, and he came to our museum just 30 minutes before we close, because that was the last day of our special exhibition on Korean War, and he said that his father was in the in the ship that came from North Korea to Korea, and obviously his father was so lucky, and as he said a number of times, he really struggled from his youth, because his father came as a refugee from North Korea. But so he's very democratic, I think, and he's a very good man, and he sort of succeeds the policy of so-called sunshine policy of former President Roh Moo-hyun. We call it moonshine policy. So his idea is totally different from the conservative, politicians. But we are just in the age of democracy, so Koreans can do whatever because they are confident. They can do anything, even if North Korea, break down. We are ready to take over. We are ready to help those fellow Koreans in North Korea. I myself want to go to North Korea and help them. Just selling all the belongings that I have. As Germans did. In their unification era. So Koreans are really full of will to be democratic. Thank you.
Right. I think we unfortunately have to.
Yeah, let me just mention one thing to give a plug to the Wilson Center. Robert Litwack has, that's available on the Wilson Center website, a paper of, 80 to 100 pages on a proposed strategy for dealing with the North Korean nuclear issue now, which I think is very much worth reading.
Well, before we thank our great speakers, I just want to quickly thank Joshua Spooner, Diana Kang, Yoon Jung-yu, and Haejin Kim for helping arrange today. Thanks also to our sponsors, including the National Museum of Korean Contemporary History and to Korean Air. Now, please join me in thanking our speakers, and join us on the 4th floor for a reception and some drinks. Thank you.